Middle-earth is more than just land. It is the memory of ancient heroes and the terrors that awoke with the first light of dawn today. An old wizard will tell you yet another legend, so you may understand that even the darkest times can give birth to light in the days after the shadow fell, and the fires of Mount Doom grew. Still a hush came over the lands of Middle-earth. The Great War had ended, the One Ring was unmade, and with it Sauron the Deceiver had vanished, his vast might broken and swept away. Like smoke upon the wind, the world breathed again, though it trembled in the silence that followed. But not all hearts were stilled with joy. Far to the north, beyond the flowering fields of Gondor and the white city crowned in light, the elves walked beneath trees that were growing old. Their song, though fair, was laced with sorrow, for they knew the time of their people was passing. The age of the elves had waned, and though no armies marched now, and the dark lord was gone, another shadow crept quieter, colder and born of change. It was the shadow of fading. Three among the Eldar bore great burdens, still though not of iron or fire. These were the 3 rings of the elves, Villiania and Neria, crafted long ago in secret by Celebrimbor of Aegean, untouched by Sauron's hand, but bound to the fate of the One Ring. None the less, as long as the one endured, so too did the 3 when it perished in the fires of Orduin. The power of the elven rings began to dim. Galadriel of Lothlorien, Berinia, the ring of adamant, and with it she had kept her woodland realm unstained by time or sorrow. Beneath its power the Malar trees bloomed forever golden, and the air was ever fragrant with song. Yet now the borders of Lothlorien shivered, the light growing thin beneath its leaves. Eland, half-elven lord of Riendell-Borvilia, the mightiest of the 3, the ring of sapphire, with it he healed and preserved, keeping Imadris a haven of peace and law, safe from the darkening world. But even he could feel it now. The edges of the valley grew dim, and the air grew chill, even in spring. And Neria, the ring of fire, had come at last to Gandalf the grey Mithrandir, to the elves who had used its secret flame to bring courage where despair fed, and kindled hope in the hearts of those who stood against the dark. But with Sauron's fall, the fire within Neria had begun to cool. The elves knew what was coming. They were immortal, yes, but not immune to the passing of the world. The power that once preserved their realms was dwindling, and they could not stop the tide. Yet the rings themselves remained beautiful and perilous still. If left in Middle-earth, what might become of them? Could another rise to master them? Should some lesser evil be drawn to their power? Could the elves, clinging to their magic, be twisted into a shadow of what they once were? This was the conflict that now stirred in secret hearts. Galadriel stood upon the hill of Saran Amroth and looked out across her land, where the first blooms of fading could already be seen. Eland sat long in his high study, speaking seldom. His thoughts turned inward, and Gandalf wandered the roads again, cloak gray with dust, seeking something not even he could name. Then in the quiet of an evening thick with stars, a summons came. It was Galadriel who sent the call, though no bird bore it, and no rider galloped across the lands. The elves speak in ways unknown to mortals. Her message passed on wind and river and tree. Router felt in the marrow of those who bore the 3. Come, the merchant said, let us speak together before the last choice is made. And so they came from the golden woods of Lorien, came Galadriel tall and proud, a soft glow ever about her, though her eyes held sorrow deeper than time. From the vale of Rivendell rode Eland, lordly and wise-clad in twilight silver, and from the south came Gandalf, weary and cloaked in shadow, though his eyes still burned with quiet fire. They met in LOTRs where the stars hung close, and the waterfalls never ceased in the house of Eland. They gathered in a chamber lit by the memory of ages where banners of forgotten kings still hung, and the air smelled of parchment and old wood there with no others to hear. The three ring-bearers spoke. The debate was long and heavy with silence, for each bore not just a ring, but the weight of an entire age. Galadriel spoke first, her voice cool as winter water. "We have held the beauty of the elder days in our hands," she said. "We have preserved what once was against time and sorrow, but now the rings are but embers in the ash of Sauron's ruin. If we cling to them, we do so in pride. We must let them go." Elrond's gaze was steady, and yet in letting them go we pass from this world entirely. Middle-earth will change, and never again shall the elves shape it. Gandalf was quiet, his hand resting upon the staff that had walked with him from forest to fire. Then he spoke, his voice low and filled with the memory of many voices. "Change is the law of Arda. Even the stars do not hold their place forever. The three were not made for dominion, but for preservation. That time is over. What we must ask is not whether we can keep them, but whether we should." A hush fell then, for they knew it was true. The rings were fading, the elves were fading, but the shadow of power lingered, always tempting, always whispering. Though the one was gone, the hunger for mastery remained in the world. To leave the rings behind was to risk that shadow awakening again. To bring them across the sea into the undying lands was forbidden, for they were born of mortal craft. Then Galadriel said what they had all feared: "We must destroy them. One final fire, one final ending. Only thus can the danger pass utterly from this world." Elrond bowed his head, and Gandalf closed his eyes. The choice was made. But how does one destroy what was made in secret by the greatest smiths of the Second Age? What fire could unmake what Celebrimbor had wrought? Not any forge in the lands of men would do. And so they devised a plan, one that would take them to a place long forgotten, deep in the heart of the mountains, where even the dwarves no longer delve. The journey would be perilous, but the fate of their kind, and perhaps all free folk, depended on it. And so the tale begins when the three ring-bearers took counsel beneath the vaulted roof of Elrond's house. They spoke not again of delay, nor doubt. The choice, once made, stood firm, for such was the way of the Elar, and of those who had seen the long span of years pass like rivers beneath the sun. Yet though their hearts were resolute, the road ahead was veiled in shadow, and they would not tread it lightly. Long they pondered where such a fire might be found that could unmake the rings of power, those fair and perilous relics wrought in Arrakin, when the world was younger and the shadow had not yet spread its hand so wide. The common flame of forge or hearth would not suffice. Even the fires of Ordroan, which had consumed the one, lay still, and no living being now could pass into its heart and live. Nor could they seek the undying lands and cast the rings into the sea of light, for these were not the makings of the valor, nor would such acts be permitted by the stewards of the West. Then Eland remembered a place of old spoken of in whispers among the long masters of his house, a forge hidden deep within the roots of the misty mountains, older than even Khazad-dûm, carved in the dark by beings whose names had faded with the ages. It was said that in the deep places where stone meets fire and water sings through cracks in the world of flame, still burns the flame of unmaking, kindled not by hammer or bellows, but by the earth's own sorrow. There, if anywhere, might the three be brought to their end. Though the path would be hard, no other could be found. Galadriel said little, but her eyes gleamed with ancient knowing, and her silence bore the weight of stars. Gandalf, for his part, agreed swiftly, for he had walked beneath every mountain and through every shadow and he knew the cost of leaving such relics untended, and Eland who had dwelt long in. The memory of pain and hope alike rose from his seat and spoke words that rang with finality. Then let it be done, let us make ready, and take the rings into the deep earth, where none shall ever claim them again. It was decided that no host would accompany them. Such a journey must be made in secrecy, for though Sauron had fallen, the world was not yet safe from greed and folly. Rumors had already begun to stir of gold hidden in the ruins of Barad-dûr, of sorcery lingering in forgotten corners of power that might yet be seized by those who hungered after thrones. If word of the three rings reached the ears of such men, no peace would hold. Therefore, in the space of a fortnight, the three made their quiet farewells in LOTR and Galadriel, walked the golden paths one final time. The malin leaves shone beneath her feet, and the silver rivers whispered, as if in mourning. To her kin she said, "The time of our realm is over. Lorien shall fade, and the trees shall sleep, but we have kept the life for as long as was given." She took with her nigh the ring of water, which gleamed like starlight upon her finger. Eland stood upon the high balcony of Imladris, his gaze set toward the east, where the sun rose with ever greater haste as the world of men grew in might. He left his sons in care of his house, and Arwen, though wed to King Elessar, sent him her blessing across the wind Vilya. The ring of air rested beneath his sleeve unseen, but heavy with memory. Gandalf, who had been a wanderer since the elder days, bore no house and no court, but he visited the gardens of Minister Tyth before his departure there. He spoke in quiet tones to King Elessa and the Queen Unomile, and then to Frodo Baggins, who still lingered in the city, his spirit wounded though his task was done. To Frodo Gandalf gave no counsel, but only a look of such warmth and sorrow that the hobbit wept without knowing why. Thus the three departed under cloak of night, not upon great steeds or with banners flying, but clad in gray and brown, as travelers who sought no company through the wild. They went along the hidden roads, passing through the lands where no kings held sway and no songs were sung. They journeyed westward first, skirting the borders of Dunland, and crossing into the wild hills that brooded at the feet of the misty mountains. Snow clung still to the high peaks, though it was the season of spring, and the wind was sharp with the breath of the heights. By old tracks they climbed, following the secret ways long forgotten by men, until at last they came to a deep vale where the stones were black and the trees twisted, and the air carried the scent of old fire. There beneath a looming crag lay a cleft in the rock, narrow and dark, as if the mountain itself had been torn open by some forgotten wrath. No light entered there, and no bird sang above it. Gandalf, standing at the mouth of the CLFD, placed his hand upon the stone and said in a tongue older than Quina, "This is the place." Galadriel stood beside him, her face pale and set. "Then let us go down into the earth and do what must be done." They entered the mountain. No torch they bore, for the rings themselves cast a faint and eerie glow. The tunnel wound downward like a coiled serpent, cold at first, then warm, then stifling. As they descended, the walls sweated with strange vapors, and the stone pulsed faintly, as if the mountain itself were alive and dreaming. At last they came to a chamber vast and hollowed by forces no craft of dwarf or elf had shaped. In its heart stood a pool of fire, not red nor gold, but white as moonlight, and veined with veins of blue and silver. It shimmered with a light that burned without heat, and yet it seemed that if one looked too long upon it, they would see things not meant to be seen, things forgotten by the world and buried in its bones. This, said Gandalf, is the flame of unmaking. None of them spoke for a long While then Elrond stepped forward and drew Villia from his hand. It shone like the morning sky, fair and unmarred, and in its heart a sapphire gleamed with unspoken longing. He held it aloft and said, "Farewell, keeper of hope, may thy beauty return to the stars whence it came." And he cast it into the flame. There was no roar, no cry, only a sudden brightening, and then the ring was gone. Galadriel followed with a hand that did not tremble. She removed nigh the ring of adamant, and it glittered cold and clear like ice caught in sunlight. "I have held thee long," she whispered, "and through thee I preserve what would have faded. But now the world must go forward without thy grace." She let it fall. The flame leapt once white and fierce, and the ring was consumed. Last came Gandalf Narnia. The ring of fire had ever burned with quiet defiance, and in his hand it fled once more, as if knowing its end had come to the hearts of the free. Said the wizard, "Thou gavest courage, return now to the deep places of the world, where thy fire shall trouble none." And he dropped it into the light. The chamber pulsed, and then was still. The rings were no more the light of the flame, dimmed not with a flicker, nor as a candle failing, but as if some veil of time had been drawn across the world, and with it a great weight passed into the depths. No echo stirred the hollowed chamber, no voice rang out to mark what had been done. The air was thick with silence, and in that silence the three stood unmoving, each bound by their own thoughts, their own memories, and the grief of final parting. For though they had long known that such an ending must come, yet the moment of it carried a sorrow that reached far beyond words. Galadriel's gaze lingered upon the fire, her features carved in shadow and starlight, and a faint glimmer lay upon her cheek, as if the mountain's breath had caught at her eyes. Long had she borne Naya, and through it held at bay the gray tide of fading Lothlorien had been her refuge, and her charge a fragment of the elder days, preserved amid the worlds, forgetting now that time was ended. And though no chains bound her, she felt as one released from a long vigil, with none left to relieve her watch. Elrond stood apart, tall and still, his hands at his sides and his eyes closed in his heart. He heard the music of Imladris, as it had once been the laughter of his children, the rustle of books long studied, the soft footfalls of kin that had gone beyond the sea. Villar had sustained his realm, but not by dominion. It had preserved peace and wisdom in a world that too often forgot. Both its passing marked more than the loss of power. It was the end of an age of memory, and Gandalf, who had walked in many guises and spoken many names, seemed somehow smaller now, though no less wise. For Narnia had been more than a ring of fire. It had been a light in the dark, of flame to kindle hearts when all others failed. He had wielded it not as a lord, but as a steward of hope, a wanderer who bore burdens not his own. And now that fire had gone out, yet in his eyes there remained a gleam, not of loss, but of peace. For he knew that endings, though sorrowful, made way for beginnings still unseen. At last Elrond stirred, his voice low and steady. "It is done," he said, and the words fell into the chamber like stones drop in a pool, rippling outward into the silence. Galadriel inclined her head, and Gandalf gave a weary nod. None among them spoke of what might come next, for the doing had been the task, and the road beyond would shape itself in time. They turned from the flame and began their ascent, each step up the winding path echoing faintly in the deep. As they climbed, the air grew cool once more, and the breath of the upper world reached out to meet them. The gloom of the mountain faded by slow degrees, until at last they emerged once more beneath the open sky. Twilight had fallen, and the first stars had kindled in the heavens. A wind from the west stirred the trees upon the mountainside, And in the hush of that hour all things seemed suspended between what had been and what might yet come. None among them spoke for a time, and each looked out across the vast lands that stretched beneath the peaks, lands that had known war and wonder, sorrow and song. It was Galadriel who broke the silence, her voice like the wind. "Through leaves we are diminished," she said, not in bitterness, but as one who speaks a truth long foreseen. "No longer shall the hidden realms endure, their beauty shall fade, and we shall pass into memory as the stars pass into the morning. And yet said Eland, what we have wrought in wisdom, what was done in mercy, and in valor, that shall remain. Not all that is fair must be preserved in crystal or in stone. There is beauty in the fleeting, if one has the heart to see it." Gandalf smiled, then a quiet smile, touched with a sorrow too deep for words, and a hope too simple for pride. And perhaps in the hearts of those who come after some echo of that beauty shall endure, for the world is changed, yes, but it is not ended, not while song is sung and hearts are kindled, not while courage lingers in the hearts of the small. They camped that night beneath the boughs of the high pine wood, kindling no fire and eating but little. The stars wheeled slowly above them, and in the stillness they could hear the whisper of the world turning. No dreams troubled their sleep, though each bore within them the weight of long years and many partings. And when the morning came, it did so softly with pale gold upon the peaks, and the hush of snow melt in the valleys below. They rose and took their path eastward, for it was agreed that they would not linger long in the lands of Middle-earth. The ships that waited in the havens would not tarry, and the straight road would not open again for all time there. Task was done, and there home lay across the sea. But even in leaving they were not unchanged, as they descended from the mountains and passed once more into the lands of men. And trees, a change could be felt in them. Their footsteps no longer pressed so heavily upon the earth, and the air seemed to pass through them as it does through leaves falling in autumn. The rings have been a tether to the world, binding them in power, and in presence with their passing the bears themselves began to pass. Beyond the world's hold in the days that followed they made their way west, but they did not go openly, for they were known still to many, and their coming might draw eyes unwelcome. Through quiet vales they passed, through wood and field, speaking little and resting less in the lands about the brandy wine. They met again a familiar figure, one who had borne a ring himself and been scarred by its weight. Frodo Baggins stood beneath the buffles of a willow, his eyes wide and wondering, for though he had been told of their journey, he had not thought to see them again upon this shore. "Gandalf," he said, and his voice was small. The wizard knelt beside him and placed a hand upon his shoulder. "It is I, Frodo, lad. We are bound for the sea and the rings." Frodo asked, though he seemed already to know. "Gone," said Gandalf, "as they must be. The world is made new." Frodo nodded slowly, and for a moment he was quiet. "Then perhaps I too may find rest," he said at last, and the look in his eyes was one of deep weariness mingled with fragile hope. "You shall," said Galadriel gently, and in her voice was the promise of stars long past from sight. They left him then, but not alone, for his path too would lead westward, and the day of his own sailing drew near. As the ring-bearers walked west, the land grew gentler, the light softer, and a hush fell behind them, as if even the trees knew that a chapter had ended. They did not look back, for what lay behind was fading, and what lay before was a shore beyond sorrow. They would come at last to the gray havens, but the tale of that arrival and the ship that waited is for another telling. It was in the quiet lands west of the Shire, where the fields roll gently and the sky stretches vast, and open above them that the road at last turned toward its ending there beyond the hills of green and the murmuring rivers that have no name in the tongues of men lay the havens gray, and still like a dream remember the sea could be heard faintly even from afar, a deep and rhythmic whisper older than the mountains and unchanged by the long years of war and peace alive. The three who had borne the rings walked now in lands untouched by shadow, yet their hearts were not untroubled, for the leaving of Middle-earth was a heavy choice even for those who had dwelt long within its bounds, though they had laid down their power and cast there treasures into the deep fire. The memory of ages clung to them still, and each step toward the western shore echoed with farewell. They passed through the outskirts of the Shire unseen by most save a few who still remembered tales too strange to be false. Farmer Cotton's son claimed to have seen a tall figure with silver hair walking at dawn beside the bywater stream, though no tracks were left upon the bank, and no shadow fell upon the grass in Micule delving. The wind stirred the leaves of the party tree with a voice like gentle laughter, and old Samwise, sitting quietly upon his bench, turned his head as if he had heard a name spoken faintly on the breeze. Yet the bears did not tarry, for the hour drew near. At the edge of the Emmenide, the tower hills that watched the sea, they paused from those green slopes. The straight road could be glimpsed, though to mortal eyes it was but the glimmer of waves far off beneath the setting sun. To Elven, and to those few granted sight beyond the circles of the world, the way was clearer. There the world grew thin, and the veil between what is and what lies beyond grew worn like silver rubbed too long by the hands of time. They stood upon a rise, and the light of evening fell soft upon their cloaks. Galadriel lifted her face to the west, and a song came to her lips low and filled with the echoes of Valinor. It was not a song of grief, though sorrow dwelt within it, but rather a song of return, of long voyages fulfilled, and home seen again after years beyond. Counting the wind carried it gently, and even the stones seemed to hush in reverence. Elrond stood beside her, tall and still, and though no tears marked his face, a deep longing stirred within him, a longing for the white shores and the light beyond the sea, and for the days before the world was broken and the stars had names unspoken by men. He thought of Cryan long gone into the west, and of Arwen who would not follow, and the choice that had bound them apart. And he knew then that no gift comes without cost, and no farewell without. Gandalf said nothing, but in his eyes they danced to light, as though a veil were lifting at last, and behind it the stars of his own kindred shone. For he too had come out of the west, clothed in mortal guise, bearing no sword nor crown, but wisdom veiled and fire hidden. Now that task was ended, and he would return not as Mithrandir the great pilgrim, but as Olorin's servant of the secret fire and friend of the children of Iluvatar. They descended the last slope in silence. At the foot of the hill, beyond a hedge of flowering heather, the path widened into a causeway of pale stone, worn smooth by no feet save those of elves, and those chosen few who passed out of the world. The sea lay beyond, silver under moonrise, and the ships waited white and tall, their sails unfurled, though no wind yet stirred them. The havens of Mithlund, built by Caiadin the shipwright, rose in quiet majesty, and the towers of the harbor glowed with lanterns that did not flicker. Curtin himself stood at the end of the pier, robed in sea gray, and bearing the look of one who has watched many tides rise and fall. He bowed low as they approached, though no word passed between them, for their minds met in stillness, and no speech was needed. He had known that this day would come, and his work was near its end. And there upon the quay, standing with quiet resolve, was Frodo Baggins the ring-bearer, who had carried the greatest burden of all, and come through darkness in a light beside. Him stood Bilbo older now than seemed possible, and yet there was a sparkle in his eye that no age could dim. Samwise was there too, though he stood a little apart, his hands clenched as if he might yet hold back the sea. Gandalf stepped forward, and his cloak stirred in the salt-laden breeze. "Well, my dear hobbits," he said, his voice warm and deep, "the time has come." Frodo turned to him with a gaze that held both peace and sorrow, for though his heart yearned toward the west, it grieved also for the Shire, for Bag End, and the party tree, for Sam and Merry and Pippin, and all the simple things that make a home. Yet he did not waver, for the wound he bore would not heal in Middle-earth, and the sea called to him as to a ship long morrowed, and at last loosed upon the tide. They embraced as friends long parted and long bound, and then Galadriel took Frodo's hand in Eland, aided Bilbo with a quiet smile, and together they boarded the ship. Cararden nodded once, and the sails caught the west wind. Though no breeze could be felt, the ship slid silently from the quay, and the sea opened before it like a pathway of light. Those who watched did not speak, for words had no place in such a moment. As the ship passed out into the deepening night, Gandalf stood at the stern, his staff laid down, his eyes turned toward the setting stars. Galadriel sang once more, and her voice lingered long in the hearts of those who heard it. Though the words faded like mist, Eland gazed eastward for a time, and then he too turned his face to the west. The ship sailed on, and the world behind grew dim as the white ship passed beyond the last foaming spray of the harbor. The lands of Middle-earth faded like a dream at dawn, and none who remained on those shores could see where it went, nor chart the course it followed, for the path of the elven ships did not curve with the world, but rose instead upon the straight road drawn out from the circles of the earth into the deeps of heaven and beyond the reach of mortal sight. There was no sail to fill with storm, nor prow to cleave the wave in haste, for the journey that now lay before them was not governed by wind nor time, but by the will of Iluvatar and the grace of the west within the vessel. There was no fear nor disco, for each of those who stood upon the deck had borne burdens long and bitter in the sea, which to mortal hearts may bring dread, or longing to them sang only of peace. The sails glimmered like frost beneath the stars, and the waters dark and deep beneath them gave no threat, only a sound like breathing made by the world itself. In sleep Galadriel stood near the bow, her hands resting upon the rail, and the light that dwelt in her, the light of Valinor, that no shadow had dimmed, shone soft upon the timbers. Her thoughts stretched far, touching upon the memories of Lothlorien, of Caris Galadon, in bloom of the voices that had once filled the golden woods, now fallen to silence. Though she did not grieve, for though she loved Middle-earth with a love that had endured the passing of ages and the fall of kingdoms, she had known always that her time there would pass. She had lingered long, perhaps longer than any save the Astari, and had tasted both sorrow and hope in full measure. Elrond sat in quiet beside his kinsman Bilbo, who slept lightly bundled in blankets, with his face turned to the sea. The ancient hobbit murmured in his dreams, though whether he wandered again through the lanes of Hobbiton, or spoke with elves beneath the stars of old, none could say. Elrond's mind, though weary, did not rest, for it turned now toward the land. He neared a land he had not seen since the first age, when the world was new-shaped, and the Valar still walked at times among the hills. He remembered the great white trees and the shining towers, the golden light of Lorelin, and the silver of Telperion, though those had perished Long before, and he knew, that a man was changed as all things are changed by the passing of the world, but most of all his heart turned toward a face that he had not seen in an age, the face of his beloved Celebran, who had passed into the West long before him, wounded and worn by pain that he could not heal now at last. He would see her again. The thought of it brought neither joy nor sorrow alone, but a mingling of both, as a man feels who comes home from war to a land he scarcely remembers, and yet has never forgotten. Gandalf stood apart, robed in white, and the stars above him seemed brighter than before, as though some barrier had been passed, and the heavens had opened wider. He looked not back toward the fading land of Adar, nor forward toward the white shores of Orissa, but upward into the deep sky, and beyond even that, for he too had passed out of the purpose for which he had been sent, and the form he wore, though noble and wise, was but a garment. Now lightly he had done what he was meant to do. The fire he had carried had kindled other fires, and the hope he had whispered into the hearts of many would echo far beyond the span of his ears. Frodo leaned upon the rail beside him, silent for a time. He had spoken little since the ship departed, and none had pressed him to speech. The sea breeze lifted his curls and touched his face with salt, but he did not weep, nor did he smile. His thoughts were like mist rising slowly with the sun, shapeless at first, but beginning to take form. The pain in his shoulder, which had clung to him since that dreadful night on Weathertop, had eased a wound. His heart, which the ring had carved with fire and shadow, no longer burned, and yet he felt not healed, but emptied as a vessel long used, that has been poured out at last and left clean but hollow. Beside him Gandalf placed a hand gently upon his back. "There is healing in the West," he said, not loudly, and not as one who teaches, but as a friend who reminds another of what he already knows. Not forgetfulness, Frodo, nor the loss of all memory. You shall not become someone else, but you shall become yourself again. Frodo turned to him and nodded, not with eagerness, but with acceptance, I hope. So he whispered, "I am very tired," and Gandalf smiled, as one who has seen the long journey of the weary and knows that the end is near. So they sailed on, and the moon climbed high above them, casting a silver bridge upon the waters. The stars wheeled in their slow and stately dance, as they had done since the awakening of the elves beneath Quivian. The sea lay smooth and deep, and no storm rose, and no creature stirred the waters beneath the keel. And at last, in the far distance, there rose a gleam on the edge of the world, a line of brightness, faint at first, then glowing with gold and pearl, as if the sun were rising beneath the ocean. Galadriel lifted her head, and her face grew radiant there. She said, though none had asked, "There lies the blessed realm." The ship glided on, drawn as if by music, toward that far shore where the light was not of sun nor moon, but of something older and more enduring, the light that had been before the making of the world, the light of the thought of Iluvatar made manifest. And thus they passed out of the world. What lay beyond, no tongue of mortal or elf may tell, save those who dwell there and do not return. Bees. But it is said that in that land all things that were fair and true in horror find their echo, and are healed. It is said that the weariness falls away, and the memory of pain is softened into wisdom. And it is said that those who come there find rest, not the sleep of forgetfulness, but the peace of fulfillment. The ship was gone, and the sea closed behind it, and the world went on. In the days that followed the sailing of the white ship, Middle-earth lay under a strange and quiet sky, as though the very airs had grown still to mark the passing of those who had borne its greatest burdens. The wind over the Shire carried a lingering fragrance of salt and blossom, and the folk who tilled the fields and tended their gardens looked up, now and then without knowing why, and paused with their hands upon their spades or their pipes, and some among them would say, "Softly, a change is come." Though none could say what it meant, Sam Wise Gamgee, who had stood upon the Greystone quay and watched the sea draw away the ship that bore his dearest friends, returned at last to Bag End, and to his Rosie and their children, with eyes deeper than they had once been, and a silence upon his lips that no tale could wholly fill. Yet in time he smiled again, and the soil of the Shire remembered his touch, and his children learned to sing the old songs and laugh in the sun. But always in his heart there was a soft ache like the hush before twilight, for he had glimpsed the edge of the world and heard the last chords of an ancient melody. And it is told that many years later, when his life's work was fulfilled and the days of his dwelling drew near their end, he too was granted passage upon a ship, and came at last to that far shore where Frodo waited. But for the wide lands of Middle-earth the world turned anew, the elves their great work finished departed in silence many of those who had lingered in hidden glades and hollow hills, now made ready to sail, and the gray havens became a place of farewell, a place of long partings, and songs sung beneath the stars that no man could translate. The ships came less often, and soon none at all, and Cian the shipwright, having watched the last sail vanish upon the sea, laid down his tools, and walked into the west his task, complete Lothlorien once bright with the everlasting bloom of elven art and the subtle power of Naya grew dim. The golden mallar tree shed their leaf for the first time in many long years, and though their fall was slow and sorrowful, it was not without grace. The Lady Galadriel's voice was heard no more among the glades, and the Galadriel her folk passed over the mountains and out of the land. In time the woods were hushed, and the golden light faded into memory. Travelers from the south or the east who dared the borders found only silence and the rustle of leaves in the wind in Imladris. The house of Elend remained for a time held in peace by those who loved it still and wished not yet to leave the world. But though the walls stood firm and the waters still sang in the valley, the heart of Rindal had gone. Its master no longer walked the libraries, nor stood upon the terraces at dawn, and the light of Villia, once hidden but strong, had vanished utterly. It became a place of reflection and of learning, yet the high wisdom of the firstborn was less often heard in its halls, and men who visited found a quiet sadness there, like the echo of a harp that has ceased to play throughout the realm of Gondor and the northern kingdoms. A new age dawned. King Elsa, born of the line of Ilas, and the hope of old ruled with wisdom and strength, and the peace that had been dearly won began to settle upon the land. Under his hand the white tree blossomed anew, and the silver banner flew high above Minster roads long broken, were rebuilt towers restored, and ancient wrongs redressed. He did not forget the elves, nor the hobbits, nor the dwarfs, who had labored and fought in the great war, and he called them friends and kept their names in honor. Yet though the king was wise and his reign was long, even he could not stay the tide of time, for with the passing of the rings the subtle enchantment that had lingered in the world began to lift. The very air grew plainer, and the hills more solid, and the stars seemed farther away. The old magics faded not as a fire put out, but as mist under sunlight, and the wonders that once danced on the edges of sight withdrew beyond reach. No longer would forests speak as they had in Fangorn, nor rivers gleam. With hidden song no longer would a traveler find an elf watching from the trees, nor the hush of unseen power along the ancient roads. The beauty of the world remained, yet it was a mortal beauty, now shaped by hands of men, and the seasons of the earth. In the north the dwarves of Erebor, and the iron hills prospered, delving deep once more in shaping halls of splendor. But even among them the tales of old grew dim, the memory of Duran's bane faded into legend, and the sound of hammer and chisel grew louder than the echo of ancient griefs. Gimli, son of Glóin, who had fought at Helm's Deep and stood beside the fellowship in many perils, did not forget his oath in his old age. He was granted leave to sail west, a thing rare and unheard of among dwarves, and he passed into the undying lands with his friend Legal, whose heart had turned seaward at last. So the great rings were gone, and the three most beautiful of them, wrought with such care and hope, now lay in ruin. Their power released, their bearers departed no longer. Did any hand hold them, nor any eye behold their light. What they had preserved was lost, yet not wholly, for the memory of their work endured in the law and in the hearts of those who cherished what had been. And in time the lands of Middle-earth forgot the rings of power, became stories told in whispers, then in song, and at last in riddle and rhyme. Children played at being Elendor, Galadriel, and few believed the stories had ever been true. Yet the stars shone still above the mountains, and the rivers ran onto the sea, and in quiet corners of the world an old wind stirred the grass, and the stones remembered. Thus ended the tale of the three rings, and the final act of the elder days. But in the wide realm of Arda, where shadow once ruled and light fought long to prevail, a new age was begun, an age of men of toil and freedom, of sorrow and joy mingled as ever they are. And though the great ones had passed beyond the reach of time, their song did not end, it changed, and was heard anew. Long years passed after the fading of the elves and the departure of the ring-bearers, and though peace endured under the rule of King Elissa and his queen, even star of the world did not sleep, nor did its path lie straight, for the hearts of men are ever turned toward hope and shadow alike. And though the dark lord was cast down, and his works brought to ruin, the echo of his malice remained like smoke, lingering in a valley long after fire has died. Yet the strength of that shadow could no longer take root in the same soil, for the ancient seeds had been plucked up, and the rings that might have nourished new corruption were gone forever from the circles of the world. Still the memory of their making endured, and in the north and south alike, in the halls of law and among the secret councils of kings, there arose questions that none could answer with certainty. For though it was told in song and tale that the three rings of the elves have been unmade in fire, not kindled by mortal hand, few knew where or how, or by whom the final deed had been done. The elves had vanished like snow upon the mountain wind, and they left behind no tokens of their passing, save the deep silence that falls when a mighty song is ended in the years following the War of the Ring. A quiet unease stirred in the hearts of the wise, not for fear of Sauron's return, for that threat was utterly broken, but from the knowledge that power once released into the world does not depart without leaving its mark. And though the one was destroyed, and the three were no more, still the memory of them called to some, as the echo of a harp string might call the hand that once plucked it among the men of Gondor, and in the white city whose towers gleamed anew under the reign of Elissa, the law masters began to gather what fragments could be found of the histories of the rings. Old scrolls were sought out from the deepest vaults, parchments half consumed by time and worm bearing the mark of a region, or the script of Imladris, the records of Isildur, were studied anew in the Red Book of West March, preserved by Samwise, and entrusted to the care of the king, became a treasure of greater worth than gold. Yet even in these pages there lay more questions than answers, and it was whispered in some circles that not all of the tale had been told, and that what had truly passed between the final bearers of the three was known only to them, and would not be spoken again in this world. In the north the descendants of the Dunedain watched the hills with clear eyes and patient hearts, for they were a people born of silence and shadow, and they knew that though evil sleeps it never truly dies, rangers still kept the hidden paths, and though their numbers were fewer than in the days before the king returned, their vigilance did not falter among them, were tales passed down by word alone of a hidden fire in the mountains, of a path untrodden by mortal foot, and of three who had passed that way and returned no more far to the east beyond the lands where the White Council had once cast its gaze. There were still places untouched by the light of the West lands, where the memory of Sauron was not hated, but worshipped in secret, and where the tongues of men spoke his name, not as curse, but as promise. There among the ruins of ancient temples, and in caverns deep beneath the mountains, strange things stirred men. Of ambition and pride sought the shards of old power, believing that some fragment of the rings might yet be found, that some embers of their might had escaped the flame of unmaking, but they found nothing, for the flame had consumed more than metal and jewel. It had devoured the very purpose of the rings, unraveled the weaving of their enchantment, and returned their essence to the deep from which it had once been drawn. Even the memory of their touch upon the world was fading, though it lingered still in the minds of those who had seen the light of Lothlorien or walked the quiet halls of Imladris. Yet there was one place where their passing was not forgotten. In the library of Numinous, the restored seat of the kings in the north, a chamber was set apart, small and still, walled with stone brought from the ruins of Fernast, and lit by no flame, but by a skylight through which the stars could be seen. Even on the darkest nights within that chamber lay a single manuscript, written in a hand both elegant and grave. None knew who had penned it, save that it bore no seal nor sign of Gundor or Arnor, and its language was a mingling of Quenya and Sindarin, threaded with the speech of Alinor. It told the tale of the three rings, not their forging nor their long years of keeping, but their end. It spoke of the meeting of the ring-bearers, of the descent into the mountain, and of the flame that had been found at the roots of the world. It named no place, nor gave a map, nor marked a time, and it bore no author's name, yet it rang with the truth of ancient things. And in reading it, those who had hearts attuned to such matters felt a quiet awe fall upon them, as if they had touched the hem of a story too great to be wholly told. This book was not shared among the people, nor copied into the common tongue. It was guarded not out of fear, but out of reverence, for in it was a remembrance of the final choice of the elves, not a tale of war or triumph, but of renunciation of sorrow willingly embraced, and of power laid down not in defeat, but in wisdom. And as the ages turned and the shadows of the past faded further, the story endured only in this one place, and in the hearts of the wise, who still spoke the names of Galadriel, Eland, and Mithrandir with love and longing. Thus it was that the tale of the three rings passed into legend, and from legend into song, and from song into the dreams of children who listened on winter nights beside their hearths, wondering at the stars and at the silence that dwells behind the world. For though the rings were gone, and their bearers had passed beyond the see-something of their light, remained hidden in the heart of the world, waiting to be found not by craft nor spell, but by those who remember what was once true and hold fast to it, even as the years turn. And so the tale was not ended, but passed on in the waning years of the Fourth Age, when the days of the Ealer were but a memory whispered in the leaves, and the High King Eliezer sat upon the throne of Gondor. Still hale and far-sighted though the weight of years pressed upon his brow, there arose among men a strange yearning for the past, not for its glory nor its wars, but for the fading light that had once dwelt among the ancient forests and high halls where elves had walked. For though the world was now ordered under the rule of men, and its lands bound by law and peace, there were some who felt that something precious had passed beyond reach, like a voice calling across a chasm too distant to be understood. In Minas Tirith, where the towers rose white and proud above the vale of Anduin, the scribes of the king's house labored still in the keeping of law. They had gathered many books and scrolls brought from the four corners of the realm, from the ruins of Ostalath, from the quiet vaults of Dol Amroth, from the halls of Erebor, and the library of Imladris before its long silence. Yet among all the gathered wisdom of men, dwarfs, and elves, there remained a great blankness, a page not marred by ink but by absence, and it was the story of the end of the three. Much was known of the forging of the rings, and of the works of Sauron in the days before the last alliance. The Red Book of Westmarch, copied and treasured in the city, gave a clear account of the One Ring, its finding, its peril, and its doom, yet nowhere did it speak plainly of what became of the three. Say that they had passed with their bearers overseas. Some among the scribes began to wonder, not in suspicion, but in reverence, whether their destruction had been a matter of design or of quiet resignation, and a few bolder in mind, if not in pride, dared to think that perhaps some remnant of their making, some hidden token or whisper of power, might yet linger in the world. Thus there began a gentle stirring, not of ambition nor of open quest, but of seeking. Among these was one named Calamon, a man of Númenórean blood, learned in law, yet more given to quiet walks and stargazing than to the ordering of chronicles. He was descended distantly from the house of Andunar, and in his veins ran a trace of the sea longing. Though he had never laid eyes upon the ocean, often he would sit in the garden courts of the city at dusk, reading aloud from the lays of old, or pondering the fading light as it fell upon Mindela. Heart was filled not with restlessness, but with wonder, and he carried always a sense that some tale yet waited to be told. One autumn, when the trees upon the slopes of the Eld Dwath turned to fire, and gold, Calamon was granted leave to travel north, bearing a letter from the king. To the stewards of Annúminas he went not as an envoy, but as a guest and a scholar, for there was peace between the lands, and the king himself had walked those ways in his youth with him. He took few possessions, a satchel of parchment, a quill carved from the feather of a swan of the Anwin, and a small jewel given to him by the Lady Arwen, pale blue, and veined with white, a token of favor and remembrance. He journeyed slowly, pausing at inns and wayposts, speaking with travelers and old men in village halls, listening to the tales that yet lingered in the north, like leaves caught in the crook of a tree. And as he passed through the rolling hills of Ainur, and saw the ruins of Fernost gleaming in the mist, and the stars kindling above Lake Evendy, a hush came over his heart, and he began to understand that the past was not gone, but waiting like a voice beneath water, clear only to those who dare to listen. At last he came to Anios, and was welcomed with Kindness the city had grown anew under the hands of men, its walls rebuilt, and its towers crowned once more with banners. Yet it was no longer a city of war, nor even of rule, but a place of memory, where the kings of the north were buried, and the stones bore the names of those who had passed into legend. The stewards brought him into the house of law, and there he saw the manuscript, the single page written in the tongue of the Eldar, which none had dared to translate fully, and none had claimed to. Right, it was not long nor richly adorned, but the letters seemed to shimmer faintly in the lantern light, and when Calimon first beheld them, his breath caught in his throat, for he felt in that moment as though a presence lingered in the room, not seen, not heard, but since like the first scent of rain upon dry earth, or the hush before the breaking of dawn, he asked leave to study the page, and it was granted. Day after day he sat in that quiet chamber, copying the words by hand, not in haste, but with the care of one who transcribes not a tale, but a living flame. The language was clear to him, though grave, and in its rhythm he heard the voice of the sea and the whisper of stars. The tale it told was simple and yet profound. It spoke of three weary and wise who came to the foot of the mountains and passed beneath them. It told of a fire untouched by forge or spell, a light born not of the world, but of its sorrow. It named no names, gave no dates, offered no boast. It was a song of ending, of choosing to pass, rather than to remain, and in the final lines there was this, not for power, nor to preserve what must fade, but to guard the hearts of those who come after. For beauty, when grasped too tightly, becomes a cage, and only in its passing can the world be free. When at last he set down his quill, Calimon sat for a long time in silence. He did not speak of what he had felt, nor did he seek to explain it in the tongue of men, but he asked that a copy be made and sent to the king, and that the original remain undisturbed as it had been. And then he departed, walking alone along the hills of Arnor, not seeking discovery, but listening, for he knew now that not all truths lie in the finding, and not all endings must be remembered to be fulfilled. Thus the tale of the three was carried onward, not in fire nor in the flash of steel, but in the hearts of those who chose wonder over possession and remembrance over dominion, and in the quiet corners of Middle-earth where starlight touches fern and stone, and where the wind still carries songs older than the moon. The world stirred softly, awaiting the next voice. How the years of the fourth age flowed onward as the slow rivers of Gondor, winding and patient, ever seeking the sea. And though the great powers of the elder days had withdrawn beyond the grasp of Middle-earth, still the world turned beneath stars unwary. The lands once scarred by war grew green again, the scars of fire and ruin hidden beneath fields of wheat and shadow groves, and the voices of children echoed where once only cries of battle had rung. Yet beneath this peace there lay the deep and solemn knowledge that an age of marvels had come to an end, and that what followed, though good, was shaped by different hands, mortal, fleeting, and ever yearning. In this new age, memory itself became a kind of power, not loud nor splendid as the gifts of the rings, but subtle and enduring. Those who still remembered the elder days, those whose feet had walked under Elberth's stars with the elves, or stood upon the battlements of Minster. Turth in the war of the ring grew few, and among the youngest of the realms of men, and even in distant lands untouched by that great struggle, tales began to pass into the realm of myth, and myth into forgetfulness. Yet memory has its own way of enduring even when it is unspoken. There remained places in the wide world where the touch of the three could still be felt, not in stone nor in flame, but in the very air and water in the hush beneath. Ancient trees, or in the sudden stillness upon the highest. Hills when all the world seemed to hold its breath and laugh lorn. The trees stood still, their trunks grayed with time, their leaves no longer golden save in autumn. But no axe had felled them, nor would they break while root held stone the stream of Nimrodel, yet sang in the cliffs of the hills. And some said that on moonlit nights a voice might be heard there sweet and sorrowful, as if one fair and ancient called across the years, not seeking an answer, but giving farewell in the valley of Imladris. Though its halls were hushed, and its gardens untended, a strange peace lingered. The birds that nested beneath the arches of the broken bridge did not fear men, and deer came down from the heights to drink at the river, without trembling those few who made pilgrimage to that place, scholars, poets, wanderers, seeking no gold, but only understanding, spoke afterward in quiet tones of dreams filled with starlight, and of waking with tears on their cheeks, and joy they could not name even in far Mythland, where the gray havens had grown still, and the white ships no longer came. There remained a feeling of waiting. The towers stood tall against the western wind, their bells silent, their sails furled, yet the sea beat steadily upon the shore, and the gulls cried overhead, not in sorrow, but in longing. And upon the highest hill, where once curtain had stood to greet those bound for Ammon, a tree had grown slender, silver-barked, with leaves that turned from green to gold with the seasons. None had planted it, and none dared to cut its boughs, for it was known by the old mariners as Eleanor the Starborn, sprung from no seed of Middle-earth, but from the memory of those who had passed westward. In such ways the three endured, not in substance, but in spirit, for their power had never been rooted in dominion or force, but in preservation and beauty, in the will to guard what was good, and to resist the slow encroachments of decay and despair. And though the rings were unmade, and their bearers departed, the work they had done could not be wholly undone, for even now their legacy lay scattered across the world like petals borne on the breeze, small and unseen, but living. Yet there were still those among men who could not rest, while even the shadows of power remained unaccounted for in the east and south, where the reach of Gondor did not yet extend in strength. Old superstitions stirred, there arose whispers in the marketplaces of Cand, and in the deep canyons of Herat, of sorcerers who claimed descent from the Nine, of relics unearthed from ancient tombs, of dark jewels that glowed with inner fire. Most of these were lies or folly, tricks played upon the ignorant by greedy hands. But once in the eastern desert, beyond the sea of Run a Rider, came to Minas Tdh bearing a tale. He was a man of no great name, clad in the manner of a desert wanderer, his skin burned by wind and sun, and his eyes shadowed by long sleepless nights. He spoke of a ruin of stone, doors carved with elvish letters sunken beneath sand and vine, where none dwelt and none dared linger. He claimed to have entered this place by chance, fleeing from pursuit, and within he had found a chamber untouched by time, where the air was sweet and the light never failed. Upon the wall had been etched 3 signs, a star, a flame, and a wave. When asked what he had seen there, the man grew silent, and his hands trembled. Nothing, he said at last, and everything. There was no treasure, no crown, no weapon, but I felt, watched, judged, perhaps as if something old still lingered and would not suffer another's touch. King Elissa himself questioned the man, and though he was no elf lord nor wizard, the king's gaze pierced through falsehood as sunlight through mist, and at the end sent the rider away with food and coin, but no command to return, for he judged, as all wise kings must, that some truths must lie undisturbed, and that the works of the three though vanished, were not for men to possess or ponder over long. But he went afterward to the hall of kings, and stood before the white tree, and for a long while he said no word. And when the stars came out, and shone through the high windows upon the banners of his fathers, he whispered a name Mithrandir. Thus it was that the memory of the rings, though passing into shadow, remained like the afterglow of a sun set beyond the hills, a light not seen, but still felt and in the hearts of the wise and in the quiet corners of the world where law is kept not in gold, but in silence. The tale endured. It was no longer a story of might, nor even deeds, but of a choice freely made to let go what might have preserved their realms for an age, in order that the world itself might heal. And that is a story worth telling, even when its ending lies far behind the hills of time, in the fullness of years, when the reign of King Elissa approached its destined close, and the realm of Gondor stood tall in peace and splendor the memory of. The elder days became like starlight seen through mist, still lovely, still true, yet distant and softened by the turning of time. The great halls of Minister Tirth were filled with law, and the white trees stood blooming in the court of the fountain. But the voices that once sang beneath the malin trees of Lothlorien, or whispered in the silvered woods of Imladris, were heard no more. The elves were gone, and their works had faded, and though the world was bright, it was changed in those final years, when the king's step had grown slower, and his hair silvered like the foam upon the sea. There came to him often a longing, not for power, nor for years unending, but for the company of those who had passed beyond, for he remembered still the ring-bearers who had walked beside him in shadow and in light, and his thoughts would return to Frodo, and to Mithrandir, and to Galadriel, and Eland, and the quiet courage that had borne them through fire and loss. To the fulfillment of their purpose he would stand at times upon the high walls of the city, gazing westward as the sun fell beyond the Effluith, and though no ship had sailed from Mithland in many years, he would hear the distant sigh of the sea in his heart. It was in that season, as the leaves of the white tree turned to silver, and the wind carried a sharper breath from the north, that the king received a final gift, though none could say from whence it came. It was brought to him by Famer Prince of Ethelion, who had found it left upon the eastern banks of the Anduin, near a stone that bore no name. It was a slender box of blackwood, polished, and without mark, bound with a silver clasp, broad in the likeness of 3 stars entwined. No seal bore witness to its maker, nor did any hand confess to having crafted it. When it was opened in the king's chamber, within was found a single leaf, long and narrow, of a kind not known to any living tree in Gondor or the north. It was pale gold, yet did not wither, and its surface bore veins of silver like threads of moonlight spun by the hand of Vard herself. Beneath it lay a folded parchment, brittle with age, yet unmarred by damp or decay, and written in a hand both fair and strong. Elisar took the parchment and read it in silence, and when he had done, he closed his eyes, and the lines upon his face seemed to ease, as if some burden long borne had been set aside. What was written there he never spoke aloud, and no copy of it remains in the archives of Minister. Yet it is said among those who keep the old law that it was the last word of the elder to the world of men, not a warning nor a command, but a farewell, a blessing given freely for those who would live after and remember with honor. And this it said according to those few who heard its telling from the lips of the king. In his final days the rings are no more, and their keepers have passed into peace. Yet the work they began shall not be forgotten, for though time shall wear all things in memory be. Buried by the dust of ages still shall the light of what was wrought endure in the hearts of those who love what is fair, and who guard it not for gain, but for the joy of seeing beauty kept for its own sake. Let no hand seek to remake that which was broken, nor to grasp what has been freely relinquished, for the world is changed, and must grow as it will without the crutches of old might. But in every leaf that turns to gold in autumn, and in every child who looks upon the stars with wonder the gift of the three shall be remembered thereafter. The king spoke no more of the rings, nor of the elves who bore them, yet he walked often in the gardens of the city, and in the woods of Ethelion, where the Malaron trees had been planted by Sam Wise Gamgee in the days after the war there. He would rest beneath their shade his eyes, close his hand upon the hilt of Andril, not as a warrior waiting for battle, but as a man waiting for the end of a long and noble story. And so in time the king laid himself down upon the high bed of the kings and passed away in peace. His reign ended, but his memory ever green Arwen his beloved mourned him in silence, and at last departed alone into the empty lands of Lorien, where the leaves fell and no song answered her voice. In the years that followed, the kingdoms of men endured. The house of Elissa ruled wisely, and the realms of Arnor and Gundor were held in honor and justice. But never again did a ring of power pass among the peoples of the world, nor did the light of the elder days return. That time was ended, and the world had turned, yet the tale was not forgotten. Among the scholars and singers of the West, the story of the three rings remained, though it was told now not as a chronicle of deeds, but as a parable of letting go, of choosing the road that leads not to glory, but to healing. And though some doubted, and others turned their hearts to lesser things, there were always those who remembered, and who passed on the wisdom of that final choice. Thus the fire of the rings, though quenched in the world, still burned in the spirit, and in quiet places where water runs clear and stars are mirrored in still pools, those who listen closely may yet hear the echo of that high and noble resolve, a vow made in the twilight of an age, and kept even beyond the shores of time. The world was changed, and none there were who denied it, though many could no longer say what precisely had departed, nor whence it had gone. The days of the elder kindred were no more, and the footsteps of the firstborn no longer graced the hills and glens of Middle Earth. The white ships no longer came to Mythland, and the gray tide of the sundering sea broke upon deserted shores. Its sighing mingled with the wind among the stones. Yet though the elves had faded into legend, and the three rings with them had passed utterly from the world, still there were traces, shadows of light, that lingered in quiet places, like the memory of a song once sung by a voice now silent in the woodlands of Athelion, where once the war had burned fiercest, and Orcreek had fouled the green buffles. There now bloomed gardens unlike any seen since the elder days, through the care of the stewards of that land, and the wisdom of those taught by the hands of Samwise Gamgee and his kin. The trees grew tall and fair, and strange flowers blossomed in the shade, blooms pale and delicate, whose names came from no tongue of men, but from elvish roots forgotten by most. Some said they were the last echo of Naya's craft, born not from enchantment, but from the memory of what had once been. For beauty, once cherished deeply, does not wholly vanish, even when the hand that tended it has gone beyond recall. Among the folk of the northern vales and the southern coast, stories were still told beside half-fires in the long winter nights, tales of the great war of the Dark Lord, who had ruled from a tower of iron, of the ring that ruled all others, and of the brave souls who had cast it into fire. But fewer now spoke of the three, and when they did, it was as of a dream. from a vanished world, a myth of sorrow and splendor whose truth could neither be proved nor wholly denied. Yet some remembered in the house of Elberin's son of Famir there was kept an ancient book passed down through the years, in whose pages was penned a song said to have been written by the hand of Frodo Baggins himself before his departure. It told of the three, not in tale or in history, but in verse veiled, and high it sang of water that ran beneath. Moonlit trees of a fire that warmed but did not burn, and of a wind that carried voices long still few could read the Elvish in which it was written, but even in translation it moved the heart with longing, and those who heard it wept, though they knew not why. In the White City the law masters preserved what records they could, and the king's heir ruled with honor. But even within the walls of Minister Change had come the light that had once crowned the citadel, at dusk seeming to catch fire upon the stone now shone, more dimly, not by any loss of lamp or sun, but because the seeing of such light had waned in the eyes of men. The marvels of the elder days lay behind them now, like a land glimpsed in a mirror or a garden seen only in dream. Yet the king's line did not forget, and in each generation there arose one or two who would steal away at twilight to look westward from the high tower and wonder, even among the dwarves who speak seldom of elvish things and whose hearts are turned toward stone and fire and the shaping of metal the tale of. The three found a place in the great halls of Erebor, where the hammer rang once more and gold flowed like rivers through the forges. Gimli Ylfrin was honored beyond all reckoning. His name was carved in mithril above the gate, and his deeds sung even in Keir Odal, though the dwarves were not quick to lift their voices in song. It was said that he had passed beyond the sea, the only one of his kind to do so, and that he bore with him the memory of the ring of fire and the wisdom of Olorin. And though the dwarves did not speak of such matters in the hearing of strangers, there were smiths who would pause in their work and look into the flame and remember. But it was in the Shire, perhaps, that the passing of the three left its gentlest trace there, where the green hills rolled untroubled and the stars hung bright over quiet lanes. The tale was not forgotten. Old Sam, wise gray of hair, but still firm of step, would sometimes sit beneath the party tree and speak softly of days gone by. He spoke not often of the rings, nor of power and peril, but rather of Galadriel's mirror, and of light in dark places, and of a fire that burned within the heart. When all hope seemed lost, his children listened wide-eyed, and their children after them, until the tale became part of the land itself, woven into the roots of trees and the sin of the earth after rain in his last years, when Rosie was gone and Bag and stood. Quiet Sam would take out a small box carved with runes of silver, and within it was dust like fine ash gray and shining faintly in the light none. But he knew whence it came, though some guessed it was a gift of the lady, and others thought it born from the fire. Where the one was unmade, he never said, but would look upon it with a soft smile, and then close the lid and whisper something in a tongue few understood. And when at last he too departed, and the last of the 9 walkers was gone from Middle Earth, he was laid to rest beneath a mallant tree that had never ceased to bloom. Even in the heart of winter, the people of the Shire did not speak much of the rings thereafter, but the garden was tended with care, and in springtime, when the blossoms fell like golden snow, the children would gather beneath the tree and sing songs older than the hills, though they knew not from whence they came. For the power of the three was never in the stone or the forging, but in the choosing and in the love of what was fair. And though the hands that bore them were gone, and their light quenched in the world, the things they cherished endured. A blade may rust and a tower crumble, But beauty remembered is a seed that grows again. So came at last the waning of that great tale, whose roots stretched deep into the elder days, and whose flowering had cast long shadows upon every land. Beneath the stars the rings of power wrought in secret, and in beauty forged with the wisdom of the Eler in. Tainted by the malice of Sauron had all passed away. The one was unmade, and the fire of Orduin the Nine had been scattered or buried with the wraiths who bore them, their dominion broken and their horror spent. And the three fairest of all had been cast willingly into the flame of unmaking, not by force nor in haste, but by choice and wisdom born of long years and deeper sorrow. Yet though they were no more, and their bearers had departed beyond the circles of the world the tale of, the three was not wholly lost, for it was not in the power of the rings alone that their legacy lay, but in the hearts of those who had borne them. And in the world they helped to shape a world not preserved from change, but guarded from corruption, so that when the time of the elves was ended, the dominion of men might come not in ruin, but in hope. Thus the lands of Middle-earth entered fully into the age of men. The towers of Gondor rose high above the Anduin, and the banner of the White Tree flew far and wide, not in conquest, but in fellowship. The realms of the north were restored, their stones laid anew with craft both strong, and fair peace flowed in the veins of the world like spring melt from the mountains, gentle but inexorable. And though not all evils were ended, nor all griefs healed, yet the heavy shadow that once lay upon all hearts was lifted, but the echoes of what had been lingered still, not as a burden, but as a breath upon the wind in the high passes of the misty mountains where no dwarf now delved, and no elf walked beneath. The stars there remained a stillness deep and watchful, as though the very stone remembered a fire that had once burned within its roots. Travelers who passed there in the rare seasons of calm would sometimes pause and speak of dreams half-remembered, of voices that murmured in forgotten tongues, and of warmth that came not from sun or flame, but from the very bones of the earth in the south, among the hills that bordered the old land of Dun Harrow. A shepherd boy once wandered too far from the flocks, and came upon a circle of ancient stones, black with age and veined with silver like frost caught in iron. There he heard a sound like weeping, and when he returned he bore a white flower in his hand. Though none such grew in those lands, he could not say what had moved him, but he kept the flower pressed between pages of an old book until the end of his days. And in the west, in the twilight lands, where the sea broke upon the hidden shores of Linden, the gulls still cried as they wheeled above empty harbors, and the wind bore upon its breath a faint scent of marl blossoms. And far-off fire mariners who sailed westward in small boats, seeking only fish and calm waters, would sometimes gaze into the sunset and feel their hearts stirred, as though they had forgotten something long ago and were on the brink of remembrance. But no ship passed into the west, for that way was now closed, and the road to Ammon lay only in song. Yet the tale endured past from tongue to tongue, changed in the telling, but not in its truth. In the white tower of Atelian, the heirs of Elendil preserved the memory of the rings, and the king's counselors taught their children not only the history of war and rule, but of renunciation, of the strength it takes to let go what one might rightfully keep. Among the Dunedain, who still wandered the wilds of the north, the tale was held in reverence, not as a legend to stir the blood, but as a star to guide the heart. And in the Shire, though the years turned, and the outside world faded once more in a hearsay, in rhyme the old stories were told beneath the eaves of Bag, and where a small red book still rested on a shelf wrapped in cloth, and carefully kept children would ask their elders on clear nights, when the stars shone like diamonds, if the elves still sailed from the gray shores, and whether it was true that some had chosen to destroy their own rings, the answer ever and again was the same yes, my dear, they did, and in doing so they saved more than we can ever know in time. Those who had known the bearers of the three passed away, and even the names of Galadriel and Eland and Mithrand grew distant and rare, spoken only in ballads and the dreams of poets, but the deeds they had done bore fruit beyond reckoning. The grace they had kept alive in their realms had kindled hope in the hearts of mortals, and that hope passed on like a flame from candle to candle, would outlast the stones of kingdoms and the echoes of great horns. Upon the wind, for what they had given was not domination nor the ending of time, but a space in which the world could breathe again, a space in which new stories could be born unshackled by fear or despair. They had been stewards of beauty, guardians of peace, and when the time came they had laid down their tools and passed into the west, leaving behind no monuments, but a legacy stronger than stone. Thus ended the tale of the three rings, and with it the final bond between the elves and Middle-earth. It was not a tale of conquest, nor even of loss, but of release, a gentle yielding to the rhythm of the world and to the call of the sea. And though the rings themselves were gone, and no hand would ever wield them again, their light endured in memory, in longing, and in the quiet strength of those who chose in their turn to do what was right, though it cost them all they had, and far away beyond the gray veil of the world, in a land no mariner now may reach, three figures walked beneath trees that never withered, beside waters that remembered the stars. They spoke no more the days that had passed, for they had entered into peace beyond tale or song. But sometimes it is said, when the wind is still and the sky is deep, a voice may be heard in the dreams of the wise, and it sings not of power, but of grace, for the end of all things fair is not darkness, but the passing of light into light, and the world made new again waits still for those who remember.